Hi, my name is Ben and I'm a Senior Support Engineer here at GitLab. This video is designed as an asynchronous tool that can be used in combination with the code contribution support training issue, which I'll provide as a link in the description of this video. This video is designed to cover a few key important concepts, predominantly around contributing code to the GitLab codebase. First of all, we start with the user story. As a part of this video, we'll be using an example of a similar to real life situation, which we'll be doing to design the code that we're implementing. Next, we'll briefly be discussing accessing your GDK or GitLab Development Kit environment and a few different ways you might be able to access that, especially if you're accessing it remotely. Next, we'll talk about the database, including making database changes like writing migration files. Then we'll talk about the backend, which includes actually writing the Ruby code changes to make changes or to validate changes that we're making or that a user is making. Next, we'll talk about the front end side of things, which is talking about how a user will actually make the changes themselves. We'll write about test files, including how you write tests, including first some of the backend changes that you write in the Ruby code. Then we'll talk about feature flags, which talks about how we limit our implementation of a change on the GitLab codebase to a specific user or group or project. And then lastly, we'll be talking about preparing an MR. So in order to sort of talk a little bit further about what we're doing, we're going to briefly look at the user story. So in this situation, we're talking about a scenario where in 20XX, a new social media platform has taken the world by storm. Both the company and social media are known primarily as Acme. With growing interest and demand, some users have expressed an interest or a desire in sharing their Acme profiles on their GitLab accounts. So you may have seen, if you have your own GitLab account, is that you do have some social links that you can add. So very common things like Skype, Discord, Mastodon, stuff like that. You can provide a link that links back to your profile. So this example is that there's a brand new social media site that we want to add. There's some details here that we're going to come back to as we're writing our code. So we know that the company name is Acme. The main website is acme.example.com, and there's an example profile URL of acme.example.com, and then there's a slash, the character A, and then there's a series of numbers behind it. So we'll keep this in mind as we write our code later on in the video. Moving on, we're going to talk about how issues are useful for finding new contributions. So if you're doing the support training issue and you're looking for issues to work on, the gitlab.org/GitLab issue tracker is often a good location to find bugs and features for things that you might be able to work on. Specifically, there are a few things that you can search for. I like to search for things based on features or categories that I enjoy working on, and that's sometimes a good way to get some quick wins for what you're looking for. Specifically, quick win as a label is also useful for finding issues that are being marked as small or concise, and that might also be useful for you to start as a bug fix or a feature request to implement changes in the code base. So keeping in mind that issues are what we like to look for, if we look at the example that we have here, in our user story scenario that we have, let's say that a new issue has been raised on the GitLab issue tracker, which is asking us to add Acme to our user profile. So release notes is sort of what's intended to be introduced or added to like the GitLab release page, which is that user profiles will now have the ability to display a link to an Acme social account. We can also see that the problem in the proposal is basically talking about let's add Acme to our profile accounts and stuff like that. So if we divide this into its core components, there's a few main things that we can take a look at. First of all, we're talking about in the user settings, edit profile, there should be a new section to add, which is essentially going to be between or after the other locations that we have, such as Skype, Discord, Twitter, /X, everything like that. We want to have a new option that allows someone to go in and add their own Acme link or their Acme ID. We want to make sure on the user profile that we have under the contact page that we can actually show a value of the contact address. And then we also want to make sure that if someone hovers over or clicks that link on the profile, that it actually shows the URL for what we're looking for. So we can take a look at that in a, I guess you could say in a GDK environment at the moment, and we can actually see what it looks like. So if I come over here to my GDK instance that I've created, we can see here on the right-hand side on the contact, I've got a new sort of social link here, which is directing me to Acme. And we can see in the bottom left-hand corner, this is actually trying to take me to an acme.example.com. And it's also structuring the Acme ID from what I've created. If I look at the user's edit profile, which is under profile, edit profile, under user settings, if I scroll down, there's also a section here under Acme. And then there's also an Acme ID, which is what the user currently has this set to. So essentially, as a part of this video series, this is what we're going to be looking at predominantly. Now, as we go through our example, there's going to be a couple of callbacks I'm going to reference to an existing issue and MR, which was created in September 2023 by a community contribution, which was to introduce Mastodon as a useful example to the GitLab codebase. So as we go through a couple of our examples, I'll be referencing or I'll be searching for Mastodon as an example, just because it has a lot of the functionality of the code that we're looking for. So when you're working on your own code contributions, you might find it useful to search for something that's already been implemented in terms of being an existing issue or an existing MR, and that might help you find the right location to write some of your code. So with this in mind, we're going to go to our first section, which is talking about GDK. This section will be discussing how we're going to access our GDK instance. So there are a couple of videos already on the GitLab Unfiltered YouTube channel that talk in depth about how to install and set up GDK. So we won't be going into too much depth in terms of that, but we'll briefly discuss a couple of different ways that you can access a GDK instance. So if you're deploying locally, such as on your Mac or your Windows machine, you can deploy to your local computer, preferably through a virtual machine, but you can also deploy GDK in a box, which is a virtual machine that can be deployed, such as using UTM or other virtual machine software. If you're doing it remotely, you can use software such as Gitpod, use GitLab remote development workspaces, or you can deploy to a remote virtual machine. For the purposes of the rest of this video, I will be deploying to a remote virtual machine, so any information or instructions I provide will be from that context. Because we are deploying to a remote virtual machine, something to consider is how we're going to essentially have the local port 3000, which is what GDK uses for the web UI, how we're going to have that locally on our machine or our workstation. Now, because I'm using Visual Studio Code as my editor or my IDE for the rest of this YouTube video, there's actually already a built-in functionality for me to forward my port through the IDE. But if you're doing it via different software, there is an SSH command you can use. So if you want to, you can SSH tunnel, and that essentially is saying from this host, I want you to tunnel port 3000 externally or from the remote host, and essentially pump it to localhost 3000 on my machine. So if you're using a different editor other than Visual Studio Code, you can use that. If you are using Visual Studio Code, I'll just show an example of how this looks. So we come over to this window, we can see that I'm in Visual Studio Code, and if I go to Remote Explorer here, which should be built in, you may have to configure it if you don't have one already. But under Remote Tunnels, I've already configured an SSH host, and I've already configured a preferred directory, which is in the user's home directory, GitLab-development/GitLab. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go in and connect. Give this a moment to load up. We can see it's already dropped me into essentially the directory that I want to be in with some code. And we'll go here and we'll see under ports is that we've got two different ports that are set up. Now this one currently says user forwarded. It may sometimes play up or sometimes will automatically go auto forwarded, which is great. But what this essentially means is for port 3000 on the virtual machine which we're connected to, port this to localhost 3000. So I try and open this up in a web browser and bring this across, which is just opened in a separate tab. We can see here that I'm on localhost 3000, but I'm actually connected to the virtual machine. And this is essentially my GDK environment and ready for us to do some further work on. This next section will briefly talk about the database. So as with any sort of web application, because we're making changes to data and we want that data to be persistent, we need to save that state somewhere. So for what we're doing, at least in terms of this application, is we're going to be adding an additional column or some more data to the database. And we're trying to add it to an existing table, which will already have some of the information we're looking for. So I'm going to bring us over to what we call the structure.sql file, which is essentially, at least within the GitLab application, is it's telling us, or at least it's telling the database how it needs to structure its database when it first creates it. And it'll give a bit of a hint as to what we want to do and where we want to add things. So we've come across here, I've jumped straight into in the structure.sql file to user details. And we can see, looking at a few of the examples that we saw at the beginning of this video, a few things are starting to come together. So we can see here that there are a few fields such as Skype, location, Discord, Mastodon. And so we can sort of surmise that what we want to do is we want to essentially add something to this table. We want to add something to user details. And because we're creating something for Acme, we're going to add Acme to user details. So now to do this, because we're using a Rails application, we want to write migrations files. Now, migration files are essentially allowing us to make changes without directly modifying the database. And we can look at that briefly here. I'll just come back to the next slide. So migrations allow us to prepare and create database changes without needing to manually write SQL statements. They're also important for instances which are already active or already online, because it's very difficult, or it'd be very difficult to try and make changes to an active instance by getting them to update files and whatnot. So the changes that we're writing, at least the migration file that we're writing, is useful for new instances, but it's also going to be telling existing instances what they need to do to update the database correctly. So we come back and we're going to jump into our code, and we're going to add a new file. So as I bring up Visual Studio Code, I'm going to change to the terminal. I'm going to go here, bring this up a little bit more. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a command which is going to instruct the Rails application to generate a essentially an empty migrations file, and then we can add content as we need to while we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write bundle execute Rails G, which is shorthand for generate migration. And then I'm going to write what essentially I'm trying to do. So I'm going to add a column called Acme. I'm going to add it to an existing table called user details. Now, assuming that this doesn't generate any errors, we certainly hope not, this should go through and proceed, and then it should tell me that it's created some new files that we'll be able to see as well. Okay, with that completed, we can see that it's invoked an active record and it's created a new file, which we're also tracking in our source control. So if I jump in here and go to this changes file, I will just open that file directly. We can see that it's automatically created a class name for us, which is great. So it's add Acme to user details, which is use the context or the terminology that we used in our command. And at the moment, everything is pretty much commented out except for a milestone and then a change as well. But we're going to change this a little bit in terms of what we're adding, because we want to have an up and a down function, which we'll look at a little bit later in the video. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to get rid of a couple of these comments just because we won't need them. And I'm going to add a few things and then I'll talk through them as I go. So first of all, we can see that it's defined a milestone for us, which as of the time that I've recorded this video, the upcoming milestone is 17.1. And that's a reference for the intended milestone that it wants to deploy it for. I'm going to add a section, which you may see in a couple of different database migrations, which is to disable DDL transaction, which I believe means that if you're running multiple things in a migration file, it's allowing it to sort of run them or disable running them as a transaction. There's some more information in the developer documentation, which I recommend that you check out. But what we'll do now is I'm going to add a section that we're going to reference, which is going to be user detail field limit. And I'm going to be referencing that below. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two separate functions. So I've got change, which is going to change. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say down. So what I'm going to do is change is going to become up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say with block retries do. We're going to add a column to the database. And we can see it's trying to fill out some information for us, which is great, but I'm just going to continue writing it just for the sake of showing what I'm doing. User details. So we're saying add to the table user details Acme. It is going to be text in this. The default can be blank, null will be false, and if not exists true. And we'll say end. And then within the function still, we're going to go add text limit. And this is where we can actually fill it out. We can say for user details for Acme, apply the user details field limit, which is what we applied before. So this is essentially saying the maximum amount of fields that we're going to allow into this particular Acme field is 500, and that's just setting an upper limit to the database. So that's good. So what we'll do is we'll go to the down function. So what down is going to do is when we essentially go, or if we need to down a migration, which means that we want to end it, what we'll do is it'll essentially reverse or counteract the changes. So this is going to be quite straightforward. We're going to do the same sort of thing with lock retries, do. Remove column, user details, Acme. And I'll just add an end. So end out of that, end out of that, and then end out of the class. And then what I'll do is I'm going to save this file. And what we can do is we can basically try and run it. So we're basically saying when we do a migration, or we do a migration file, when we up it, which will be the default action, it's going to try and add a column to user details for Acme, do it as a text file, default can be blank, null can be false, but it'll still be sort of a empty string, so to speak, if it doesn't exist. And then we're going to add a text limit to it as well. And then if we need to down it for some reason, we need to reverse our changes, we are essentially going to remove the column entirely. Okay, so what we'll do now is we can run the migration. So back in my thing, I'm just going to clear this out. Assuming I don't have any errors in the text, I don't think it's complained just yet. Looks pretty good in terms of formatting, defined, and it out of the class, so that looks good. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to run bundle exec break db migrate. So this would attempt to run all of the database migrations, but as I'm on this instance, we should be able to run and just have it apply. Okay, it's completed. It has thrown an error, but I think that is expected. It's just essentially complaining about a file called fiddle. But if we take a look at the main output, we can see here that it's running the migration that we're looking for, which it's already generated an ID, and it's running add Acme to user details, runs the migration, adds the column, doesn't have any complaints, completes it, completes the migration. And then we have a rake level error, but it's just complaining about fiddle, which we can leave for the time being. What we can do now, while we're here, is I'm just going to clear this again. GDK, we're going to jump into the database by opening up a PostgreSQL level sort of interface. This should load pretty quickly. I'm going to go show nice display, expanded displays on. Let's take it user details. If I expand this out so that we can see a little bit more, we can see that in the user details table, we have a column called Acme. We can see that it's text. We can see that the nullable is not null. And at the moment, at least in terms of the default, it is a text string of just essentially enclosed quotes. And that matches similar to what we see for a couple of other ones as well. So there's a few different values that will essentially just use that. And that's great for what we're doing. So in terms of the database, we now have this in the database, but we'll need to do a little bit further work in terms of getting this ready for the rest of the application. So continuing on, I wanted to briefly talk about MVC. And MVC stands for Model View Controller. So this is very common in modern day web applications, but I briefly wanted to talk about it because it might help us understand a few of the concepts of what we're going to be looking at next. So essentially divided into three elements. We have the model, which holds or collects information, view, which presents information to the user, and then controller, which helps to coordinate communication between the user and other elements. So first of all, we're going to be looking at in this is the model. So we're going to be looking at a few different things in terms of how it works. So first of all, we want to talk about delegation. So I want to provide an example, and I'm going to jump back into our code, and we're actually going to jump into the Rails console, and I'll talk a little bit about why delegation is important. So I jump back into our window. I've just cleared my terminal, and what we're going to do is we're going to jump into a Rails application. So I'm going to go bundle exec Rails console and give this a moment, and it should load relatively faster than a production instance, which is good for us, or at least good for the purposes of the demo. Okay, not too bad at 17 seconds. Awesome. So what we'll do once I actually have a console, awesome, is let's just grab the last user on this instance. Or actually, let's just grab, let's grab root. So what we'll do is we'll go user. Maybe we can do first. Let's see how that works. Awesome. So we'll grab root. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say user detail. And you remember that we modified the user detail table, at least in the database. So we take a look at the user detail field. We can see that there are a number of different values. And right at the bottom, we can see that there is a value for Acme. So this is present because we modified the database to say for this table, or sorry, for the database, ensure that the user details has an Acme field. So that's good. So we can see that the application at least has the ability to present information, but we haven't yet written anything that allows us to, I guess, control the flow of how this information is coming together. And something I want to talk about in terms of specifically with delegation is if we try and look at a field such as user.acme, there's nothing like that. But we'll look at something like user Discord, blank, okay, that's fine. User Skype, blank as well. So we can see that u.discord and u.skype are actually being provided as available options, but as we've seen, user.acme is not. And that's important because it looks at the concept of delegation. So if we come back here, we're talking about delegation, which is why is it accessible as user.userDetail acme and not just u.acme. Delegation in Ruby, which I definitely recommend having a read of the Ruby docs, allows us to delegate different things to different locations. So if we wanted to delegate something to user preferences, we can delegate X or acme to user preference, or delegate X to user details, and so on. So I'll show an example of what this is going to look like in our application. So if we come back to our code, we're going to be going to a section in, if I can go out of here, get out of my database section, see if I can search for it. What we're going to do is go app models user.rb, and I'll minimize this just so we have as much real estate as possible. We can see that there's a lot of delegation going on already in user.rb, and there's a few that we're going to be using, which there's a few that we can reference which are similar to what we're looking for. So we can see here that there's Discord, LinkedIn, Skype, Mastodon, and stuff like that. And what we're doing is we're basically saying delegate a get as well as a sort of equals, or like a, I guess you almost think of it as like a push or a write request. We're basically saying delegate these methods or delegate these actions to user detail. And user detail in this case is the user detail RB or Ruby file. So what we're going to do, just for the purposes of continuing this, is let's just add somewhere in the middle here. Let's just go under Twitter. We're going to say delegate acme and acme, yep, and we'll pretty much just tab complete that one, to user detail, and allow nil is true. So what that means is that that's now going to allow user to delegate any requests to it to user detail. And what we'll do is we'll save that page, and let's take a look at user detail. So we'll go app models user detail, and there's going to be a few things that we're going to add into this file. So we can see here, if we look at this quickly, is that there's a few validations that are handled within the file itself. So we can see starting from the top that it looks like there's some validation regex that happens for Mastodon. We're going to be doing something slightly different, but you sort of get an idea of to what's happening. And you can see that there's a lot of validation that happens. So essentially we're saying if we receive a request to user detail, what we're going to do is we're going to validate the value of it. We're going to make sure that it doesn't hit a maximum value that we've already defined, which similar to the database here is 500. And some of these also validate the format. So that means that it's validating that the format that's received is valid and is accepted. So the reason with this is that if we try to manually set a value, if I bring up my terminal for a moment here, if we were to say u.userDetail, and again, we can call this at the moment just like this, acme. Let's say that we set this to a non-standard value, or a value that is not accepted, at least in terms of the Acme Corporation sort of format. If we just said tests, and we try to save, it's now saved that. And if we try and check it again, it's saved as test. So we want to make sure that that can't happen. We want to make sure that anytime anyone tries to save the Acme value, that it's saved as a very specific string, or at least a string that we want to see. So what we can do now is we will talk about validation, or at least validation of strings. So I'm just going to bring us back here. So we want to validate Acme as well as validate the string, or at least the way that we're doing it. So we're going to be doing that in user detail, but essentially we're making sure that anytime it's called through Ruby or called through the class, that we're updating the value and we're doing it correctly. So coming back from our user story, we want to make sure the goals here are, it always starts with the letter A, and it has, let's say, a minimum of 8 digits. And we're going to set an upper maximum as an example, let's just say, because that's what the provider put into their API or their developer documentation. So it means that no matter what, at least at this stage, they intend for the maximum value for their user IDs or the user values to always be 16. So we can also hard code that into our documentation, at least in terms of what we're doing. So what I'm going to do in our code is I'm going to do a similar format to what we have for all the other values. And let's just go somewhere here again into the middle. If we were doing this for an actual code review, we might want to follow a bit more of a standard approach in terms of where we're putting it. For the time being, let's just follow the same process and let's just put this under Twitter here. So we'll say validates Acme length. So we want to do something similar. And we'll allow that to tab complete. We'll say maximum is the default field length, allow blank true. And again, default field length is just defined here, which is 500, which is also checked in the database as well. So we have a double sort of an additional level of verification. So now that's validating Acme, but we also want to validate the format that we want to make sure that you can't set a value such as tests. So what we'll do is we're going to go new line. We're going to say validate, and we're going to say Acme format. So we're going to use similar wording to what we have for, say, Mastodon and Discord. But we're going to have to create a function that actually defines Acme format for us. So what we'll do is we'll go down and we'll see if we can find a spot. And there's going to be a few locations that we might need to add Acme into as well, which I'll do quickly now. So we can see here that there's a function that's sanitizing attributes as we receive them. We can see that there's a few that are linked here already, including Discord, Skype, Twitter, and whatnot. So what I'll do for this purpose is I'm going to add this in as well. We'll say let's validate Acme as well in this private function, prevent nil fields. I'm just going to add a new line and we'll say self.acme equals blank if Acme is nil. So if we don't receive an Acme value, the Acme value for the user, or at least for the request, will be essentially a blank string, which matches what the default database value is as well. So we can see here, if we continue downward, that there's a few values for Discord format and Mastodon format. And we're going to be using something similar to Discord, but we're going to be using our own regex value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here under these two. I'm going to say define Acme format. Put an end statement in. Return if Acme blank or, and it's trying to fill the Mastodon regex, and it's also trying a bit of a guess from the Discord. But what we're going to do is we're going to do something unique. So I prepared this earlier, and I'll show an example of what this looks like for you. But essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be saying if Acme equals this regex string, and the regex string looks like this. So if you have some regex experience, you'll have a bit of an understanding as to what this means. But for those that don't, I'm just going to quickly show you in an online utility. So if we look at regex, I've already pasted in this value. This has given us a bit of a breakdown as to what we're looking at. And we can see that from the beginning of the string, we're matching the character, which is A, and then we're matching the character digit. We want to make sure that there's at least 8 to 16 values of the digit, and then we're going to the end of the string. So as an example, if we go through and I just do tests, that doesn't match, so it wouldn't be accepted. If I did A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, as the only value, I should say, so it's not doing a new line. If it wants to play nice. Sometimes it can take a minute to load. Might have to get rid of the start of the string, but then it should pick it up. Or not at all. Oh, there we go. Okay, don't know why that was playing up, but there we go. So we can see as it's going, it is picking up the values, but if we continue and we add too many, or we go over the value of 16, it then doesn't match, so it won't accept the value. So that's essentially our criteria for saying that we want this value to be accepted, or at least do it as is like this. So coming back to our code, we've defined Acme format, if Acme blank, or if Acme equals this. So it's essentially returning a check or validation to make sure that the contents is correct or the contents is what we're expecting. So now what we want to do is we want to add in a new line. If it doesn't match, errors.add for Acme. And then we're just going to add in a string. And yeah, we can autofill with that. So we'll say must contain only an Acme user ID. So essentially saying if someone wanted to come in and try and add a value that does not match this, the contents, or at least what we're expecting from the regex, do not proceed. Do not accept what it is trying to do. Okay, so we've added in a few values to at least the models, or at least in terms of what we're checking with the models, but we also want to make sure that we're updating the controllers. So coming back to what we were talking about with controllers, is there a way to essentially handle some communication, at least validate what we're receiving? So it's important in terms of what we're looking at is that, at least within the application, at least with what we're looking at, is that controllers are going to be checking against a request that's made, and it's going to be checking against the parameter that we're providing, which is Acme. So for example, if a user is trying to update a page and they're trying to update the Acme value, we need to ensure that Acme is accepted as a parameter, and also ensure that anyone that's trying to provide a parameter that's not accepted does not receive the request or does not try and change the data. So there's a few locations in the application that we need to make this change just that it accepts it. So I'll quickly go through those now. Okay, so with that in mind, if we take a look at our code itself, what we can do is take a look at a few different controllers and try to essentially try to take a look. So there's a few different places we need to go to, specifically in the controllers, which I jump back into here. We'll see if I go app, controllers, profile controllers, which handles things to do with the profile, which is the user profile. There's a function here called user parameters attributes. And similar to what we saw before is that we have values such as Mastodon, Discord, Skype, and Twitter. And for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to add this again under Twitter. So we'll just sneak it in here, say Acme and that, and save. And there's a few other locations that we need to do this as well. Similarly, we're basically just ensuring that the user parameters are accepted for what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to go to next, app, controllers, user settings, and then profiles controller, which is handling, or at least it's the controller that's handling the user settings page or the user settings sort of functions. So when a user is trying to update their settings and whatnot, we want to make sure that the accepted parameters are also modified. So again, we've got Discord, we've got Mastodon, we've got Skype, we've got Twitter. I'm going to sneak this one in here. Just say Acme. And we're going to click save. And then we're going to go to app, controllers. This time we're going to admin, and then we're going to go users controller. So if you're sort of following the terminology, or at least the wording that we're seeing at the moment, you can imagine that admin users controller is useful for an admin that is creating a user or modifying a user. So this is saying for an admin or an administrator, if they want to create a user account or they want to set the value of a user, this is also how we're controlling what parameters are being accepted for this request. So what I'm going to do is similar to this. So I'm going to sneak it in. I'm going to say Acme, and we're going to save. And from a backend perspective, that is a lot of what we're trying to do in terms of what we're trying to add. So if I reload my Rails console, just so it's fresh, and I'll give that one a moment to load, we should be able to check and validate, first of all, that our delegation is going correctly, and we'll also be able to see if our validation is going correctly too. So that one took a little longer than expected to load, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go u equals user.first. So again, we're looking at our user. Pulled up user. Let's first try to see if delegation's working correctly. So again, what we used to do, or what we were trying to do, was use user or u.user detail acme. Let's see if u.acme works. Awesome. Okay, so we're pulling u.acme, which is what we're going to be at least referencing later when we do some of the front end stuff. Let's see if I can change this to another bad value and see if it complains. Try and save. It does not accept it, which is great. So it's actually doing the validation that we're expecting. So it's basically saying that the record is invalid, and it's giving us an error, which is user detail acme must contain only an acme user ID, which is correct. So that matches the error message that we had. So if I now try and change this to a value that should be accepted, we'll start with A, and just do this backwards, assuming the regex actually works, which I believe it should. We'll go that, and we'll go save. No complaints. It's accepted it. It's true. So now if we try and check the value, it's accepted it. So from a backend perspective, that's the main stuff that we need to do. And now we can take a look at trying to do some things in the front end to get the front end working and allow a user to both view and edit the value of u.acme. So now that we've done a lot of the back-end work, we're going to be looking at the front end. And the front end, for at least for this particular change, is going to be quite minimal in terms of what we have to modify. So if you think about it, what we've done is we've delegated, or at least we've created a value, which is the user's acme value, or at least tied to the user identity or the user attribute. And then we're going to be trying to reference that within the front end. So there's a few different places that we can do that in. First of all, we want to take a look at least allowing the user to edit it themselves. So what we're going to do is I'm going to jump into our code and we're going to go to a place which will allow or show us where we're essentially pulling the information for when a user is trying to modify their user account. So back in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to close all these tabs. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to a place that's called, or at least tied to the user settings, which as you would expect is going to be an app in our main application. Because we're now doing a view, we're going to go views. We're going to go to user settings and let's go to show. And show is going to be the main component in terms of what we're looking for. So this is going to be a lot of code. I'm just going to extend this out now. But what we're going to be looking for, as you can sort of imagine, is continuing our examples, is there's a few sections here that already have some elements in them. We can see here that this is a HAML file and it's got different sections under form groups. And we can see there's a few different values. So this particular form group is all for Discord. So there's a label and a text field for Discord. There's one for Mastodon, which is a bit smaller. And we're going to be using Mastodon as a suitable example for what we're looking for. Essentially what this means is this is going to convert this value into a suitable HTML and CSS content for the front end of the page. And if we take a look at what it looks like from within the UI, I'll just switch us over and we can take a look at that. So from the UI, if this still wants to work for me, is if I was to go to edit profile, and if I scroll down, we can see here under main settings, we've got a few values such as Skype, LinkedIn, X, formerly Twitter, Discord, Mastodon. And what we're going to be doing is adding a field similar to here. So essentially we're going to be saying, let's say pretty much under Mastodon, we want to add in a field here in between Mastodon website URL. So we're going to be doing a very similar example to what's here, but we're basically going to be saying, hey, instead of pulling the Mastodon values for the user, let's pull up the Acme values. So I jump into the Visual Studio Code. What I'm going to do for this example is pretty much just copy this value. We're going to pretty much go straight under using the similar formatting. We're just going to say within this group. So we're going to have a new form group. We're going to say for the label. And this is using some of the Rails functionality in terms of being read by Ruby when it generates some files. So as you can imagine, if this is in the context of a user, we want to show their Acme value. And then similarly here, we want to say for the text field, this presents the Acme value. And then we've also got placeholder text, which is HTML code. And let's say that we want to use a reference of a placeholder of A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm going to save this page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the UI. And we'll take a look and see how this looks and see if this actually loads the current value of Acme. So what I'll do is I'll quickly jump back into that page. And I'm going to give this a refresh. I'm going to take and see how it looks. Okay, so that's loaded. Let's scroll down. And we can see it's already pulled the value of Acme for that user, which is great. So from a backend perspective, it's pulled the value of Acme and it's essentially put that in here for us. And we can see that that matches the value that we set. Now, if I was to try and go here and change something, and if I was to say test and try and update the profile settings, what it should do is, at least when it goes, it might take a moment for it to actually process it. It should try and consider this request, or at least consider it, and then it should come back saying, whoa, this is not accepted, which is correct. So that's what came here. So it says, hey, when you're trying to update Acme, it should only contain an Acme user ID. So we come back down here. It shows it here because it hasn't actually saved it. So if I go and do a hard refresh, it should bring back the value, which is great. But let's say that we got the Acme value wrong and we want it to be, let's say 1, 2, 3 at the end. We'll go update profile settings. Profile was successfully updated. And then hopefully if I give that a refresh, it's now saved that as well, which is good. So from a UI perspective, we now have the ability for the user to go in and modify the value themselves. But coming back to our user story, there is still something that we want to modify, which is when we look at the user profile, which for this example, if we look at root, what we want to make sure of is when we load the user profile, somewhere here on the right-hand page is where it wants to, essentially, we want it to show the value that we're looking for, which is for the Acme account. So we'll do that next. Okay, so continuing on, what we're going to do is we're going to jump back to the code. We're going to say, okay, let's put that one to the side for the time being. We're going to go to a similar location. This one's going to be in app. Again, we're in views. So if you come back to our MVC concept, this is in the views because we're looking at or how information is sort of returned to the user account. We're going to go users because this is applicable to all user accounts. And then this is going to be something that's fairly new in the past couple of recent editions of GitLab is we're going to look at the sidebar, and that's where the information is actually going to be for the user. So if we bring this up, if we scroll a little bit down, we can see that there's a section here, which I'll try and show a little bit more because it's very important, is there is a section within the HAML code which says if, and there's a lot of or statements here. So we're saying if the user, and the context for this is the user that we're referring to or the user that we're bringing the information up on, which is pulled from the Ruby code. But essentially we're saying if the user in question, their value of website URL or public email or Skype or LinkedIn or so on and so on is present, which means there is a value, return this content and return it if the value exists. So what we're going to be doing is right at the end of this one, let's just add in to the end. We'll go down, we'll say or at user.acme present, which we're basically saying if the user has an Acme value, continue and then present this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use similar functionality to all of this. And let's just basically come in and let's just grab this from Discord. And we're just going to copy, make sure our indentation is correct. That looks good. And we're going to say, okay, if user Acme is present. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the icon. So the icon is what's going to display. And for the purposes of, at least for the example, is I just change this to a building. And what we're going to do is we're going to link to user.acme. And then what we're also referring to here is this is a Discord URL. So this is actually a function that we're going to have to add. And what this essentially is saying is that when you present this, link, you need to present a link that points to or goes to a particular location. So I'm going to change this to Acme URL, change title to Acme. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create, essentially create the application helper, which is going to create or construct this Acme URL image. And we'll do that right now. So because we're adding essentially a helper function, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to a location, which is called app helpers, application helper. And what we can take a look at is we can see that there's going to be a few different things here. What we'll look at, continuing our examples, is that we can see that there's a value for Discord URL, value for Mastodon URL, and we're going to do a similar function. So if we take a look at what we see here is essentially it's saying return blank, also return essentially an empty string if the value is blank, otherwise construct the URL which we're going to use. So what we'll do here is I'm going to add in a new one just under these two. I'm going to say for Acme URL, pass through user, and I'll put an end. We'll say return if user.acme is blank. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to then say, essentially return a value. So similar to what we have for Discord, I'm going to provide an example, which is what we have, or at least for our user story, or for what the example for Acme is. And we're basically going to come in and we're going to say return this address, which is acme.example.com/, and then we're basically putting in the value of user.acme. It's just like that. So what I'll do is I'll save this one, come back to this page, make sure that I've saved it as well. So if user Acme is present, return all of this, and then also return the function for Acme URL. Make sure both of these are saved. Jump back to my page, which I believe I have over here. And what we can do is if I give this a hard refresh, might take a moment to load. And with that loading, we can now see that there is a contact section, which is the sort of if statement that existed. And there's also a value, which is the Acme link. So here we've pulled the data, which is A876544123, which is the new value. And then you should be able to see at the bottom left of my screen is that it's got a value, which is basically a hyperlink or linking me to the value that we're looking for. So that is essentially our front end changes complete, which essentially is now presenting this information for us. And then as we saw earlier, the user can at any time, if they want to, just like with all the other links, let's come back to the front end and they can make this change as well, just like that. So that is most of our front end components complete. So we can move on to a few more of the advanced concepts of this video. So next up, we're going to be talking about test files and writing tests. So tests are very important, and you may find, especially for more complex merge requests, is that before your merge request will be approved, or some comments that you may receive from the reviewer or the maintainer, is that they want to see some tests written to validate the changes that you've included. So in the GitLab code base, at least, they'll usually consist of at least RSpec, which is Ruby-based spec file tests for backend changes, or Jest, which is for front-end changes, and usually consists of JavaScript sort of related content. Existing tests are usually very useful for understanding some of the syntax, especially if you're new to testing. I definitely find it useful. And GitLab does have some internal developer documentation about best practices for writing and deploying test files, which we definitely should take a look at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump straight back into our code base. So I'm going to jump in here, starting fresh with some new tabs. I'm also going to exit out of my Rails console, clear this up, and we're going to take a look at a few files. So on the left-hand side, I've actually just done a quick search against Mastodon spec tests. So I've actually just filtered this under spec, and it's given me a few files that we can take a look at to reference. I'm just going to search them in here just so we can see the full path. So I'm under the spec directory, and you'll notice as I go through these folders is that they've got similar name standards to what we have within the main application. So this one is in spec controllers, user settings, and there's a profiles controller here too, profiles controller spec.rb. So for some main functions or main components within the GitLab Ruby application, there'll also be a matching spec file. So because we're adding additional changes to an existing sort of component or existing page, we should be trying to add our changes to the existing file as well. Now, where I've jumped into here as well, you can see that there are a few examples such as updating Discord and updating Mastodon. And if we take a bit of a look, we can try and understand what exactly the spec is trying to do. So this spec is basically as a part of a larger function. It is saying if we're trying to do a post update, it allows different actions. And let's say for this one specifically, it says that it allows updating the user specified Mastodon username. And it's basically saying for this username, sign in as the user, do a put request, basically updating the user value for the user, and set the parameter for the user Mastodon value to Mastodon username. When the page is reloaded, which it handles, expect the user reload value of Mastodon to equal the value that's been created, and then expect the response to be valid or to have been returned as valid. So what we can do is we can use this as a prime example to write our own test. So I'm just going to bring this in straight under here, and we're going to say allows updating user specified Acme username. So we're going to say Acme username now, and we're going to use a valid Acme username. So we'll go A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to sign as the user, put update parameters, user Acme equals Acme username, expect user reload Acme to equal Acme username. And then what we can do as well is we can actually run a test just on this specific test file. So I'll just bring up that command, and what we can do in the terminal is we can pretty much run it straight as is, just to test this section, so we don't have to run tests against every other function that there is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the binary, which is going to be bin spec, at least from the GitLab directory. And then we're going to do the path, which is going to be spec controllers, user settings, and it should be profiles controller spec. What we'll do is we'll do colon, and then we're going to provide the starting line essentially of this component. So we're going to say for this test, for describe, for this particular section, which is it on line 145, just do this test to validate it. So I'll do is I'll do 145, make sure I've saved the page, which is correct. And I'm going to run this, and it may take a moment or two for it to bring up the necessary resources to run the test, but then we should be able to view the test results once it's complete. Okay, and we're back. Now, I did have to come back to this several days later, so you may notice a few things look a little bit different. But the main thing we want to look at from running our test is this was the first time that I ran a test for a little while on this particular GDK environment. So we can actually say that the test environment build time took a little while, and that's just because it's trying to build some of the resources or components that it needs to perform its tests, or that it thinks it will need to perform its tests successfully. The main thing that we want to confirm though is because we isolated this to a single test file, is it tested one test, or it did one test, and in that it completed successfully. Subsequent tests should complete a little bit faster now that we've actually done the build. So if I do an example and we try and make this string too long so that we try and validate the maximum string that we set, and we run that again, we should see as this runs, and once it completes, it should actually come back not successful because it won't have updated the Acme username. So I'll just let that one run for just a moment and we'll take a look and see how it looks once it's done. Okay, so that was certainly a lot faster. So it ended up being 14 seconds, 40 seconds to load everything else, but we can see that there is a failure as well. And that was a failure on our test, which we tried for. Essentially what it's doing is it's trying to do a comparison. So as a part of what we've written, which we're expecting, we're basically expecting the user reload here on this line 151, is when we reload the user's Acme status, we want the value to equal Acme username. So because we have the string validation that we created, and we're basically saying if you go over a certain value based on our regex, we're not going to update the value at all. So the test was expecting this to be that value, and then it actually didn't get anything back. So I don't know if this specific file has it, but there may be examples you'll find where the test is intentionally giving the wrong value, and you'll actually see that the expect result here will be expected to not equal or to not be the value that we're looking for. So that's just an example. So what I'll do is I'll just set this back to a proper working value, and I'll save that. And what we can do is, because we've touched a few different files as a part of making this change, is that there are a few other spec files that we need to take a look at. Similar to what we did before, is that when there's a file that we've changed or that we've edited, there's usually going to be a spec file involved as well that we can also take a look at. So there's a few that I'm going to be taking a look at as a part of this section, and I'll sort of talk through what I'm doing as we go. So first of all, I'm going to go to spec again. This time, let's take a look at helpers and application helper spec. There it is right at the top. And we can take a look. So similar to what we've done before, is let's see if there's a Mastodon section here. Okay, awesome. So there's a few sections here. So there's a context of, which is basically saying when this value is set, let's create a few things. So we're basically saying for user, which might get passed in later sections, which we can see here. Let user is basically build a user for our tests. And then also let Mastodon equal a Mastodon URL for the user as well. So this may just essentially validate that when we're checking something, or we want to check that, we just want to make sure that it is set. So for Mastodon specifically, we're saying it'll return an empty string if the Mastodon username is not set. So we're expecting the Mastodon value to equal nothing, and when it is set, equal that as an example, and so on, and then also do a external redirect path URL. So this is essentially exactly what we want to do pretty much for Acme. So we can do something similar, and I'm just going to quickly write that out, and we can take a look at it once I've written it. So first of all, let's just grab this entire context. We're going to continue doing this in the same chunk. So we can see profile social links similar to this. So we've already got a Discord check, Mastodon check, but we're going to want to keep it in that same section. And let's see what okay, so we'll give it a space, go paste. And we may even just be able to get away, at least for the start, is just to do a mass change of Mastodon, yep. And then we'll have to do a few more tweaks. So when Acme is set, let it be user, build user, let Acme equals Acme URL. So remember that we defined Acme URL in a different function. That's all good, that's fine. Returns an empty string if Acme is not set. So similar to the test that we got, if it doesn't get it set, or if it's not set correctly, it'll return nothing. Exactly what we want for this test. Returns Acme URL when Acme URL is set. Okay, so that's going to be a little bit different. So remember that we're going to have to write it to be a, I guess you'd say a proper value. So what we can do is let's just say that. Let's try that. Copy that straight from there. And then we're also going to have to build a URL as well. So from memory, that's acme.example. Just like that. and we'll save that. And again, similar to what we did here is we can actually try and run a test specifically on that line. So I'm just gonna have to change this. I'm gonna go spec helpers, application helper spec, and then we can also then define it under this as well. So I think this is just a learning experience for me. I'm going to try it under the context. If that fails, then I can do it specifically under the it statements as well. So I'm just going to let this run and we're just going to see how it looks. Okay, so that's run. Let's take a look and see where it failed. Okay, so it looks like it's expecting an external redirect path. This might be how we constructed the URL, or because we're not actually doing an external redirect path correctly. But we can see it looks like our first test passed, which is great. So that's fine. So it basically ran the context when acme is set, returns an empty string, so that's correct. But we're basically not getting the external redirect path that we were expecting, which is that one. So that's okay. Something we can take a look at and try and see if we can fix up. I'm just going to see if I can figure out what it is, and then I'll update and we can take a look at it further. Okay, so this might be a good warning for not just directly copying and pasting from another example. You have to do a little bit of research. So under the main application helper, which is what the spec is for. So remember, application helper spec. The Mastodon URL is actually constructed using an external value, which is external redirect path. But because we're not doing that, we're just using a direct string. We don't need to do that. That's why it was playing up, I guess you could say. So a better example might be if Discord is set, is we just want to do an equal and then the value just like that, just as a string. So I'll just change this a little bit. We'll go equal and change that and change that and then save that and come down, and I'm just going to run that again. So again, because we're doing it under the context of when acme is set, it's going to do this. It's going to build the changes that we want it to build, and then it's also going to run the two it statements. So again, just while we wait for this to run, we're saying when acme is set, we're going to construct a user. We're going to let acme equal a URL for the user, return empty if acme username is not set, and then return an acme URL when it is set. So when user.acme gets set, expect the return result to be a URL or the user's URL that we would see on their profile. So essentially right at the beginning of this statement, there is the describe, which sort of reflects the main component of what our test is trying to do, basically saying describe profile social links. And that's exactly what we want to test as a part of this section. Okay, and we've got two examples with 0 failures, which is great. I can see it is complaining. I don't know if it's specifically my lines, but it is complaining about missing metadata feature category. We might be able to take a look at that a little bit later, but that we can disregard that for now. We can take a look at a few other test files. So there's two other places that we're modifying that I also want to see if we can update. So I'm just going to go through those two, and those are going to be on the models or the spec for the model controllers. So what I'll do for the time being is I'm just going to close out of these tabs. Let's go spec again. And remember, this follows a similar structure to the files that we're editing. So if I come over here, we can see all the files that we're editing. Here we can see that we've got a few different things. We've got the controllers, the helpers, and the models. We've got user and user detail. So what I'm doing next is, I'll just hide that for the time being, is I'm going to spec models, user spec. And again, similar to what we've done before, let's take a look at what actually is already there. So Mastodon is only referenced 2 times, which is as an it statement, we're expecting this to delegate the method of Mastodon to user detail. So if you remember what we did in the actual user detail, the user file, which will come just over here, is we're essentially delegating acme and acme equals, which is like the post or the push or like set the value. We're basically sending this to user detail. So as a part of our spec to make sure that we're doing the relevant changes, we basically want to do a similar action, and we want to say delegate acme to user detail, delegate acme equals to user detail. So for our example here, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to come in, I'm just going to jump this in, and we're just going to do a similar function, and we're going to go acme instead. And just like that. So what we might be able to do is let's see if we can just run all the delegations. So we could run like line by line specifically, but if we do 32, let's just see what this one does. It'll be another good example. So again, we're in bin rspec. This time we're in spec, models, user spec. And let's try it under the describe of 32. Okay, so again, that took a little while to load, only about 40 seconds, but I just skipped it so we didn't have to worry about that. We can see it's running a number of tests, which essentially is a part of this describe. It's all of the statements that we're setting. Most importantly, we didn't get any failures, which is great. So it means that the new delegation or expected delegation methods that we've added here, these two, they were a part of the test that we just ran, and it's also passed successfully, which is great. So that's exactly what we want. So as I mentioned, there's one final spec file that we can edit, which is going to be similar, which is going to be spec, models, user, detail, and spec. So this is probably going to be a little bit more comprehensive, because if you remember when we updated our user detail, this is where we actually did a few tests with Acme. So we validate Acme, validate its format, we do some sanitization checks, and we also define the format. So let's take a look. I'll just close out of these tabs, and we'll take a look. Again, using Mastodon as a great example, is let's take a look at what Mastodon is. So Mastodon is in its own describe state, so it's quite a few lines, and we can see that there are probably going to be similar functions for everything else. So there's something for Skype, for Discord, and this is just going to be a combination of different tests and whatnot that we're expecting to find. So before we write our own, let's just take a look and see what it does. So first of all, it's expecting the maximum validate length of this value to be 500. We have a similar test or a similar function, so we'll be able to test that as well just to make sure it doesn't go over 500. Essentially, when it is set, we're going to set a user detail to create user detail, which is creating the backend sort of stuff that we need for the test file. Make sure that it accepts a valid username, basically saying when we get a value, let's do this and expect the result or expect the value to be valid. Throw an error when the value is wrong and whatnot. And then also match when a user related like UI or returned error would be returned, also return this successfully and you know, return the error message that we would see in the UI, similar to what we were expecting. So pretty much what we could do is pretty much copy and paste, and we're just going to tweak this slightly, and we can pretty much go from there. So I'm just going to, again, bring this in straight onto Mastodon just for the sake of what we're looking at here, and we're just going to do a few changes. So first of all, I'm just going to do a massive just control, because we're doing very similar stuff. Oh, don't want to be capitalized though. That's a little bit better. So we've got our own describe statement, which is defining the series of tests that we want to run within this, basically saying expect the value of Acme to be at most 500 characters, setting up user detail, which we can use as the test, accept a valid Acme username. That, of course, is not going to pass as we go for the time being. So what we want to do is, essentially, what I'm going to do is let's just steal it from a different thing. Okay, that was a good reminder to not have your email inbox open when you're doing a recording. So what we can do is let's grab this from a different test that we were testing before. Let's go and what were we just looking at before? We could do, did we do it? No, so that was just in that one. Let's go spec controllers. Great, let's just grab the username from there because that's a valid working username. Expect user detail Acme to equal, yep. That looks good. Expect user detail to be valid. And then we also want to make sure if it's not valid or the format is wrong. So again, similar to what we did before, let's just copy this and let's just make sure the value is too long. Or actually, here's a good example. Instead of A, let's let it be B. So it could be user error that they put in the wrong value. What we'll do, let's just change this to A. Acme must contain only an Acme username. Might have to double check to see if we can improve the wording of this. This probably should be an Acme, but we'll come back to that. What we'll do is I'll just save that and we can run that describe. So again, similar to what we've done before, be in our spec. This time we're doing spec user detail spec, and we're going to do it for 184, which is this whole describe statement that we're running here. And then it's going to run multiple it checks. So 1, 2, 3, I think it should run. So I'm going to let that run and we'll take a look. Okay, so that's come back. It's actually come back with a failure. Let's take a look. Oh, well, there you go. So we actually already set the value. This is me coming back several weeks after I've written my original code. So what we can do is, because we're doing this based on the spec test, let's actually take a look at user detail and actually see what I wrote. Oh, well, there you go. Must contain only an Acme user ID. So similar to what the test has told us, this is actually what we need to write for our test. So we'll go acme must contain only n. Yep, I knew I did that right. And acme user ID. Save that. And we'll try it again. So I'm just going to run that again, doing 184, which is this specific line or this series of tests. Let that run and we'll take a look once it's done. Okay, that is looking better. So again, we did our 3 it checks or it statements, 1, 2, and 3, and all of them have come back successfully. So pretty much to round out this section on tests is if we take a look at, let's go side by side, for example. So that's our spec file. Let's open that. And then we'll take a look at user detail, open that. So if we compare between the two of them, it's a little hard to see with this sort of size, but that's okay. We're essentially validating or checking what we're doing. So I guess we could say, first of all, validate that acme's length is maximum default field length. So that's what we rewrote. That's the change that we did. We do that as our first test here. So we're validating what we've written, which basically is the value of acme is at most 500 characters, which is correct. Well, at least we're testing for that, which is good. The second thing that we do is we always validate the acme format. So if you recall, that's what we add down below here, which is acme format, return EF blank, or we'll do the regex value, which we looked at earlier. Accept that value if it matches the regex, otherwise return an error. And that's what these subsequent tests do. So if the username is valid, expect the user detail when we submit it, or if the user detail is submitted, to be valid, which will be correct for this test because this matches the regex string. Otherwise, throw an error if the username format is wrong. So again, because this regex string is specifically on the A character, it will throw an error because B is not an accepted value. And then the expectation here from this it statement is that we will return this specific error message, which will match the array acme must contain only an acme user ID, which matches what we've written. So essentially making sure that our spec tests are covering for any of our changes that we've written. Now, this is just a very quick example of what a spec file might look like. And remember that we're adding to an existing file. But if you're getting started with trying to learn how to write specs and stuff for small changes, this might give you a bit of a brief overview in terms of what you need to look for and where you might find the spec file that you're trying to write. So remember, most of the time it'll end up in a similar place to the spec file will end up in a similar place to the main app. So app models user detail, this ended up in spec models user detail spec. Things can get a little bit more tricky if we're looking at enterprise only features because they might be in an EE folder, but I think you'll sort of start to get the idea of where we're looking. And that'll pretty much round out the test part of this video. Welcome back. In this final section, we'll be discussing feature flags. Feature flags are useful when you want to implement a change into production, but you want to limit the scope of how much is introduced. For our example, let's say that we've prepared our changes for creating the new Acme social link, but some of the feedback we've gotten from the team in our early planning was that they don't yet want to implement this without seeing how it works as in a smaller scale, such as so let's introduce it for the team or the GitLab team, but let's not introduce it at a wider scale. So as a part of this section, we'll be discussing how to write a feature flag and how to implement it. So feature flags are useful in the fact that we can define them under what we call like feature actors. So feature actors are a small set of defined users, groups, or projects, which we can actually define in the creation of the feature flag. And we can basically say if a user or a group or a project has the feature flag enabled, we can then do something for that user. Now, creating a feature flag, according to the documentation, would normally use a command, which the documentation shows, which I'll bring up now. And this feature flag is normally useful for what we need, which would be essentially creating the file in the location that we expect. Now, the only problem with this is that the command it wants us to run, which is bin feature flag, given the way that I am connected to my GTK instance, which is via SSH, it's not actually going to work for me because the script itself uses, it needs to do something with the clipboard to basically copy some contents from the value. But what we can do is, in this example at least, is to essentially write it ourselves, if that makes sense. So if we look at the output, or at least of the questions that it asks us what's the feature flag type that we're creating, and we can see there's some definition about the types of feature flags on this page. the group label that we want the feature flag to belong to, and then some questions about, was there a feature issue for what we're trying to implement? What is the MR that is introducing the feature flag, which we'll discuss in the next section once we actually go and create the MR. Is there a username of the DRI, which is the person responsible? In most cases, if you're the one that's implementing this feature flag, you would be the DRI, which means that if anyone has any problems or they need to come and ask any questions, or it might be causing performance problems, they can contact you and ask this as well. From here, pretty much, this would then copy to your clipboard. It would then ask you for URL of the rollout issue. So a rollout issue is specifically about tracking the implementation of a feature flag. So once we've rolled out a feature flag, we want to make sure that it isn't just kept in the system or kept in the kept in production for beyond a couple of milestones, a couple of releases. So the rollout issue is to help us track where the feature flag is. Is it enabled, disabled? Is it removed? And that's useful as well. So it'll always take sort of prompt for this, but we'll be able to get past it once we actually go and try and take a look and create it ourselves. Okay, so I'll bring us down to our Visual Studio Code again. And what we're going to be doing is, if we take a look under config, feature flags, there's several different folders, and these are the folders that the script would normally create the file in. So we've got beta, development, experiment, and whatnot. Again, based on the documentation that I've linked, you might be able to find the most suitable feature flag for what you're working on. But for this example, we're going to do experiment. So what I'm going to do in experiment is I'm just going to create a brand new file, and let's call this Acme Social UI.yaml. Just like that. And then there's a few key keywords or key criteria that we need to use. So first of all, I'm just going to use that for the YAML sake. We need a name for the feature flag, which is going to be Acme Social UI. There's a group that this needs to be related to. So I'm just going to call this one group, tenant scale, type. Because we're in the experiment folder, let's say that this is an experiment. We're going to do some A/B testing, see how it looks in the UI. And then we always need to make sure that the first time we're implementing a feature flag, the state for default enabled is false. We do not want it enabled from the get-go once this is introduced. We want there to always be some sort of criteria that has to be met, which is usually making sure that the user or the administrator enables the feature flag themselves before they do this. So at a base level, this is what we need just pretty much to create the flag. There are, if you look at some of these other files, if we were to do the script, there are other sections which should be filled out, which includes feature issue, introduced by and rollout, and as well as milestone and all that. But for the purposes of this demonstration, this will be sufficient at least to enable the feature flag features that we're looking to experiment with. So what I'll do is I'll save this, and then we would be able to look at our code. So if we have a think about what we've actually made in terms of all of our changes, we've done a lot of back-end changes, but we only want to affect the front end for what we're doing. So let's just say the example is that most of the code looks good, but maybe the team or the developers are a little bit worried about how it'll look from a front end perspective, and they want to make sure that we can restrict who sees the feature and who tries to go in and update their settings. So essentially what that will involve is we want to add a feature flag functionality to check if the feature flag is enabled, but we only want to do it on the front end. We could do stuff on the back end as well. Feature flags are available and useful for the back end, but for this example, we'll just do a quick demonstration from the front end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a file, and we can basically go and add some settings. So what we can do here is we look at show. We have this new section that we've added here into the file, which is basically a new form group. And this, as we've seen in the UI, this is basically where we have the Acme label and Acme field, which is an editable field for the user to essentially go and add their settings. So it's actually quite straightforward in terms of what we can do. We're basically going to add a new line. We're going to say if feature enabled, question mark, and then colon, and then the name of our feature flag. So we're going to go Acme Social UI. Then we have to indent this. So this is going to be below or beneath the if feature enabled section. Save that. And this section is now covered under the feature flag. So the system will check to see if the feature flag is enabled. And if it is, it'll show the contents. And if it's not, it won't show the contents. So we want to do a similar thing potentially to make sure that This is for showing in the settings, as we can see under user settings, but we also make sure that we don't show it on the user's profile if it's not enabled for the user. So we'll go to the profile sidebar. We can skip this functionality because this is sort of just a generic sort of if statement for everything. Under this, we can say if user acme present, but we can also do a sort of almost a double if statement, if that makes sense. So what we can do here is we can say if feature.enabled, colon, again, we're going acme social UI and user acme present. So we basically want to make sure if the feature flag is enabled and if user acme present, then we can do it. Now, coming back to what I mentioned before, is by itself, this is just a generic feature flag. So this would be checking if everything is enabled, or like the feature flag as a whole is enabled. But what we want to do, coming back to those feature actors, is we actually want to restrict this to specifically users, which I'll show in just a moment. So what we're going to do for these two sections where we've done it is we're actually going to add another value. And we're going to say user, which basically, as we can see here, is it's actually checking against the user. It's going to check if the feature flag is enabled. So if feature is enabled for Acme Social UI, and then we're going to restrict this specifically to checking against the user. So I'll save that one there. I'll update this one as well. Say at user. And that's the minimum that we need to actually check against the UI. So we'll jump into the UI now and we'll take a look and see how it looks for our example. So here's an interesting thing with our functionality. So we're now back in the UI. We can actually see based on the code that we changed, because we had the main if statement, it is actually still showing the contact here, but it's not showing any details. That's fine, at least for the testing purposes. But if we were to push this production, we want to see if we can tweak that or change that just so it doesn't show this contact section. But essentially what we had before, which was showing our Acme value here, that's now missing entirely. And if we also, as the admin, try and go and test, we'll actually also find that this is missing from their settings. So we can see Discord, Mastodon, website URL, but there's no value for us to change Acme. So this means that essentially because the feature flag is disabled by default, this is not actually enabled for any users on the platform. So to do that, we're actually going to have to go into the Rails console and we can go and set it up for a specific user. Now what I want to do is I want to leave root for the time being. I'm actually going to go and create a brand new account that we're going to use specifically for this, and we'll be able to take a look at that. So I'm going to quickly jump into the admin and we'll come back once the user has been created. Okay, so I've just created a new user in the admin area for this account, which is Acme. Acme is the username as well as Acme is the name. But for this purposes, there's a few things we can do essentially to find the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into a Rails console. We're going to take a look at this user account, and then we're also going to see if we can enable the feature flag for this specific user account. And then we can impersonate them and take a look and see what it looks like from their profile. So what I'll do is let's just minimize this and come back to our code. I'll minimize this for the time being, bring this up a little bit, and we're going to jump into a Rails console. So it's a little bit different from for the GDK instance. So we're going to go bundle exec Rails console instead of just GitLab Rails console. And you'll actually find, at least I find, is that GDK loads this fairly quickly instead of on a production instance where it can take 30, 40, almost a minute. So this should load, I hope, at least fairly quickly, and we'll be able to jump in and start taking a look at a few things. Nice, 18 seconds, pretty quick. Okay, so first of all, we want to see if we can grab that user. There's a few ways to do this. We can, first of all, let's just do a general query. So we would say find by username. Okay, so that's our user, that's great. But we can also do it by user.last because they are the last user that we added. What we'll do is we'll say, let's do our first query and let's just call them user. So basically saying for the value of user, let's set this to the user object or the user actor that we can reference. Great. So now what we want to do is we essentially want to enable the feature like we looked at before, but we want to enable it just for this particular user account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go feature.enable Acme Social UI user. Okay, so that's run through. We got a little bit of a debug of what it's gone through, but it's essentially gone and made some additions or made some actions for the user account. And pretty much from there, that's made the change for the user account. So we can go in and take a look. So we'll jump back in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to impersonate the user account, and we should be able to see what looks or what shows up on their profile. Okay, so we're impersonating the user. First of all, I want to go and see if we can edit the profile as the user. Discord, Mastodon, and Acme, which is great. So for this specific user account, they can go and they can actually add their changes. So if this were a production environment or a test environment, what we could do is we could then set for a user account or for a group or for a series of projects, we could enable this at a smaller scale. And then once we were happy with it, we can make sure it looks good. So I'll go in and I'll just add another example. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Update our profile. Profile's been updated. And then if we take a look at our profile, we can see they're listed here as well, which is great. Though, as mentioned, if we go to look at a different user account, we try and take at the root user, we'll see that their details aren't showing. So for this user specifically, because they had the value set before, this is why we're seeing contact, because it's matching that if statement, but their actual value is not showing, but for this user it is. So that's a very brief demonstration of what it looks like for a feature flag to be enabled specifically for your user account. But in the event that you need to write some code that is hidden behind a feature flag, hopefully this is a little bit of an introduction to sort of explain how it all works. Okay, in this final section, this is just briefly discussing what we should sort of do to prepare our MR for production, I guess, or for commentary from other team members and whatnot. So once we're happy with all our changes, we essentially want to go and make sure that everything is ready to go and there's minimal input that's required, both from our pipeline checks as well as from the team themselves. So there's only a few things I'm going to cover as a part of this video, but they are, I would say, fairly important, or at least good to keep in mind, just that you don't get caught out once you've already uploaded your changes. So the things I want to discuss are essentially always making sure that you're actually putting your changes on a new branch. This is something I probably should have discussed right from the beginning, but we actually want to make sure that we're writing our changes to a new branch. For the time being, because we haven't committed anything, it's not the end of the world, but we can do that shortly as well. Also discussing branch names, in terms of, what you might use or how you sort of want to explain things. For the most part, these branches are deleted, but it might help you, at least personally, to have your own system in place for what you use for branch names, and then stuff as well like Robocop, because that comes in handy at least to check your at least your Ruby based code. There are other things that can be checked as well in terms of front end stuff as well, but we'll see that as a part of doing some of our pre-hook checks when we try and commit our code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump us back into our Visual Studio. I'm going to jump close some of these windows because we don't need most of them for the time being. Let's exit our Rails console. Clear this out, and we can actually see that we are still on the master branch here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go git, let's go check out, let's say B, and then in terms of my naming standards, I like to do my GitLab username and then sort of talk about what I'm doing. So similar to what we had for the feature flag, we're going Acme social UI. And now everything's on a new branch. So we don't have to worry about trying to push the master. Thankfully, master is going to be protected, at least for our user permissions. So we don't have to worry about changing too many things like that. But for the most part, this means that this is at least protected, which is what we want. So another thing I wanted to talk about is Robocop, which essentially is like a Ruby check against our code, and it's essentially validating what we've written, at least in terms of the Ruby code, meets the criteria or the standards for good and appropriate code. So this is stuff like making sure that there are appropriate spaces. We don't have like double spaces or empty lines or white spaces or anything like that. So what we can do is we can have Robocop go through and basically check against all the files that we've edited, just to make sure that they're good and there's no problems with them. So there's a command that I am using here that is essentially going to grab all of the files that we're editing as a part of our change, and what it's going to do is it's basically going to then check against those files. So I'm just going to paste this one in here after I clear. And this is essentially running git diff, only grabbing the names, only grabbing the diff filter, filtering on specific content, and then basically this is going to pipe it through xargs into Rubocop. So if I just run the first component, we'll actually see that it's basically just going to output all of the files that we're editing, which should be about 16 here, which pretty much match what we've done here. And that's pretty much going to then pass all of those into Rubocop to have it run. So I'll just clear that off again. I'm going to let that run. And this can take anywhere from a few seconds to potentially up to a couple of minutes, depending on how much you've changed. But once it's done, we'll be able to take a look at the contents and see what it's come back with. Okay, so that was fairly quick, but what it came back with was most of the files were okay, but there's a few that it is not happy about. Let's take a look here. So it is complaining that, it's actually complaining our HAML files. That's interesting. So it's actually checked the HAML files and it doesn't like what we're looking at here, or at least what we've implemented. I don't believe that this is actually a problem. I think it might just be the HAML files are not expecting the HAML and the SQL files in terms of they don't understand what it's looking at, or at least it doesn't understand what it is. Predominantly, we only really want this for Ruby-based files, so I think for the most part that this can be disregarded at least. If it was complaining about our Ruby files, then we know that we're actually in trouble, that we need to get it fixed. But again, this command might be useful, especially for your Ruby-based files, just to make sure that you're following good coding standards. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, with all of our changes in mind, or at least what we've introduced here, as long as we're happy with our changes and everything else like that, we can basically commit and push it up to our push it up to gitlab.com. So for GitLab team members, you will have access, or at least write access, to make a new branch straight off the project, which is what I'm doing here. But for community members, you may have to push to your own fork, your own fork of the project, and then open up an MR that way. So for the time being, what I'm going to do is I've already got my changes here. I'm just going to get them all ready for this commit. So they're all staged. And I'm just going to do a commit here. And let's say introduce me social link. We're going to do that as a commit. It's going to do a couple of pre-checks before it even lets us push. So again, it's running Rubocop, but I think this might actually run appropriately, or might run correctly and only check against the Ruby-based files. And then it'll run through a few other little things while it does some checks. Okay, so that's what I was expecting the first time around, at least. So all the Ruby-based files that it's checked are fine, which is great. So we know that there are at least no offenses detected, which is good. So from a local perspective, at least in terms of the commit, which is what this left hook was checking, making sure that we're not actually committing anything that's not wanted. So there's a secret detection that runs, as well as Rubocop. So those two are fine, and it's done, and it's going to basically created, or at least it's performed the commit for this, which is introducing the link. What I'm going to do now, just as an example, to continue our examples, I'm actually going to push my branch up. Complain that I haven't set the upstream, which is fine. And again, it's just going to do another check just to make sure there's a few things that are checked before it actually completes the push. You can see here that it's actually doing quite a number of different things as well. So this is a little bit more now that we're actually trying to push it up to production, or trying to actually push it up here. It's basically just doing, if there are files that it needs to check, it'll inspect them. Otherwise, it'll just skip past them. We can see that it's also running a few extra jobs. It's doing a HAML lint. There is a chance that my HAML won't actually be up to scratch. Oh, no. Okay, that's fine. So it checked the two files that we edited, didn't have any problems. Again, checked Robocop, so checked our Ruby-based files, didn't have any problems. We just have to make sure that danger and get text run okay. There's a chance danger might complain about something. Awesome. So this is actually a good example. So get text is running against our user strings. So because we've actually added a new user string, we need to make sure that the user string is added to the pot file, which is like used for translations, or for allowing you to translate things. So this is actually going to exit because it needs that string to be considered. So this is fine. So this is actually a pretty quick fix. Quite a few complaints from Markdown, but that's okay. Pretty much what I can run here is we can basically go get the text extractor for this and basically update the gitlab.pot file. So this is going to be pretty quick. So that's completed, and what we'll actually see is it's actually just changed the gitlab.pot file. So it's basically gone in and just added new string just like that. It looks a little bit weird, but it basically just added like this section, like a quote section and stuff like that. Basically just making sure that there is a ID value that exists in the pot file. So what we'll do is just make sure that's committed. I'll just do a new commit, add pot file changes. And just like that. So now in theory, we try and push our changes. I think that should exist. No, okay, we'll run the whole thing again. So run through all of our checks again, or at least our pre-push left hook checks. But we should see at least it did complain about a few things in the danger file, but that's fine. It should actually complete and push our changes up to GitLab.com. And from there, we can then raise a merge request and then essentially get it reviewed by the appropriate parties. So it's almost completed there. It's just finalizing its push. So that took about a minute or so. Pushing our changes. And it's already actually prompting us to raise our merge request as well. So if I follow this link, hopefully it goes in the right tab. That's fine. Open in a completely different window, which isn't helpful for our purposes, but that's okay. We can see it's essentially raised a merge request on our GitLab merge request or our GitLab main project. And essentially it's already using a template of what are we doing in this MR. So what we would then do as the next part of our step, I'm not actually going to complete the merge request, but essentially what we're doing is we're talking about what is our MR doing. So we're introducing the Acme social links based on the Acme company. We want to make sure that we go through the acceptance checklist as well, some screenshots or screen recordings. For our purposes, we can do a screenshot of what it looks like when the user has Acme configured, as well as what it looks like from the UI, and then validate locally. We'll have to make sure that we include steps. So this includes what steps we did, such as you need to make sure that you enable the feature flag as well. So little things like that are just what we're going to have to include. So what I'll do just to sort of close out this example is I will show what it looked like from the example that we looked at earlier, which is the Mastodon link, and that'll be a sort of a suitable example to sort of show at least what happened with a real life example. So I open up this merge request. We can see this was the one that we're referring to earlier, which is using Mastodon as a user social link. Is they showed an example of what it looked like, and their validate locally was pretty straightforward. So essentially enable the feature flag, which was enabling that for that user, edit user profile and whatnot. So for our example, we would do something very similar like that. The only final thing is that we would set this based on a couple of different labels. I don't think this user had the ability to set the groups appropriately. For GitLab team members, we do have the ability to set the labels, but what we would want to do is make sure that the labels are set correctly, and then we'll be able to find reviewers as well. So we'll actually see as a part of completing this is that it will run, I think this may be changed since then, but there is some reviewer roulettes, and basically depending on the group that's involved is you'll actually be able to ask some reviewers to start taking a look at your code to provide suggestions or improvements or feedback as well. So essentially that was our last section, which talked about how to get an MR prepared. And I hope that's been informative for you as a part of the rest of the series. Definitely open to feedback to hopefully this was helpful both for GitLab team members and potentially people outside in the community as a whole in terms of some advanced code contribution concepts. So I hope you enjoyed the video and best of luck with your next coding example.